When most people think of For Once in My Life, they think of Stevie Wonder's version, even though he didn't write the song and a bunch of other artists recorded it too. But his is the definitive version, I think. The song itself is very interesting, very complex, and it's a great example of a fancy musical technique called a line cliché, which is very cool and very important to understand. So let's see what we can learn from this. So before we get into the actual piano part, let's examine the song's structure and the chord progression, which is pretty fancy. But first, a quick look at the big picture. Compositionally, the song is 32 bars long, and we can divide that into 4 8-bar phrases, with the first and third being more or less the same. So the structure is A-B-A-C, which is normally something you're more likely to see in a jazz standard than in a pop song. And then in this particular arrangement, they start with a 6-bar intro, and then they go through the form once in the key of F major. After that, they take the last 2 bars of that 32-bar form and repeat them up a half step, and use that as a transition to modulate the whole song up to the key of F sharp. And now they play the entire form again in F sharp. Stevie plays a harmonica solo over the first 16 bars of the form, and then comes back in singing for the second half. And then at the end, they vamp out on the last 2 bars. Okay, now on to the chord progression. Let's start with a simplified version of the first 8-bar phrase that only shows the main harmonic shifts. We got 2 bars on the tonic chord F, then it moves to a subdominant chord G minor, and then in bar 6 it goes to C, which is a dominant chord, and then back to F, which completes the 8-bar phrase. So we can see that it's just a harmonic journey from the tonic chord to the subdominant to the dominant and back to the tonic. It's one of the most common progressions in history. It's totally unsurprising and a little bit boring if you don't do anything else with it. However, they do something else with it. Quite a lot actually. So let's look at how they turn what I've just described into what you hear on the record. So the first thing they do is turn this G minor into a G minor 7 and the C into a C7. That helps a bit, right? Because 7th chords are more spicy than triads. Next, they insert extra harmonic movement by creating 1/5 progressions here and here. This is one of the most common ways to create harmonic movement, right? Throw in a 5 chord. So instead of the 2 bars of straight up G minor, they alternate between G minor and D. That D is a 5 chord from the perspective of the G minor and a secondary dominant chord from the perspective of the overall key of F major. Add to that the fact that they're playing the G minor as a minor 7th and the D as an augmented triad, and instead of this, we got this. And then they do the same thing in these 2 bars of F at the end of the 8-bar phrase. In this case it's just 1 5 chord and it's got both a 7th and the augmented 5th. So instead of this, we get this. Just a quick plug, I work one-on-one with people as well, and I have some space available. So if you're interested, there's a link to some information down there. Alright, so that's half the 8-bar phrase dealt with. And for the rest of it, they use a technique called a line cliché. You take a static major or minor triad, and you move either the 5th up or the root down while keeping the other 2 notes the same. So here's a C major triad. And now I can either move the 5th up 2 or 3 steps, or the root down. And I can do the same thing with a minor triad. The purpose of this is to create movement and therefore interest without really leaving the overall chord. And For Once in My Life really exemplifies that technique. So as we've seen, the first two bars of the form are basically on the tonic chord F. But in order to create some more interest, they're using a line cliché here. They start on F for 2 beats, then they go to F augmented, then F6, and then D7 flat 9. And obviously the important thing here is the top voice, which ascends chromatically. Note that most people will call this chord here an F6, and that's how we hear it in this context. But the voicings for it will usually contain no C, so technically it's a D minor chord in first inversion. Playing an actual F6 chord doesn't work as well because the C would dilute the chromatic line. And then the last note of the line cliché, the E flat, is often just harmonized with an F7, which then usually resolves to a 4 chord, B flat in this case. But the D7 flat 9 that they use here is the more interesting option, and that commonly resolves to the 2 minor chord. So instead of 2 bars of F, we end up with this. Okay, the remaining spot in the first 8-bar phrase is bars 5 and 6. And here they use another line cliché, but where in bars 1 and 2 they took a major triad and moved the 5th up chromatically, in bars 5 and 6 they take a minor triad and move the root down chromatically. So we start with the G minor triad, then we move to G minor major 7, then G minor 7, and then C7. So instead of this, we end up with this. Okay, now that we've turned this into this, let's look at the second 8-bar phrase. Once again, here's a simplified version that only shows the harmonic skeleton. We got 2 bars on the tonic chord F, followed by 2 bars on the subdominant B flat. Then we return to the tonic for 2 bars, and then we got a 2-5, which is subdominant to dominant. And that leads us back to F. Once again, on a fundamental level, they're just moving between the 3 diatonic harmonic archetypes, tonic, subdominant, and dominant. So are they doing anything else here to make it hipper? Of course they are. They're using the same F line cliché as earlier, except there it was 2 beats each on F, F augmented and F6. And here it's a whole bar on each chord, and the third one has a B flat in the bass, making it a B flat major 7. In bar 4 of this section, they go to B flat 6. That's the same idea as the line cliché, right? Except it's not chromatic. But we still have a chord that essentially stays the same, and then one note changes to create some movement. So what could have been just 2 bars of B flat becomes this. Then we go back to the tonic archetype, but instead of F, the progression moves to the other 2 chords in the tonic category, namely A minor 7 and D minor 7. Notice that almost all the minor chords in this song are played as minor 7th chords. Okay, the last 2 bars of this second 8-bar phrase start on G minor and end on C7. So fundamentally, it's a 2-5 progression leading us back to F for the second half of the tune. But again, they put in a bunch of extra harmonic action to make it more exciting. First, the progression walks up from the G minor 7 to A minor 7 and B flat major 7. And then this happens. What the freak is going on there? Well, often the best way to understand a complicated looking progression is to start at the end and work your way backwards. So first of all, the C7 at the end is played as C13 flat 9, which is quite a posh chord. And preceding it is G minor 11. That makes sense, that's 2-5, right? And before that we got D7 flat 9. That's a secondary dominant which we've already encountered earlier. It's the 5 chord of G minor, right? And then before that we got E flat 13 sharp 11, which is a tritone substitution for A7, which is the 5 chord of D, and another secondary dominant in the key of F that we're in. And before that we got E7 sharp 9, which is the 5 chord of A, and yet another secondary dominant chord in the key of F. The whole thing is just a cycle progression. If we ignore that one tritone substitution, all the roots move in perfect fourth. Let's move on to the third 8-bar phrase, which is very similar to the first one with a couple of changes. We start out the same way, with F to F augmented to F6. And then on the next chord the bass plays F sharp instead of D, so technically that makes it F sharp diminished 7, but the harmonic function is exactly the same as D7 flat 9. And then instead of alternating between G minor and D as they did earlier, they're playing G minor 7 to C7. The next two bars are the same as before, with the line cliché starting on G minor. And then we got F major 7 to F6. That's the same move we heard earlier on the B flat. And then in the last bar of this section we got a 2-5, C minor 7 to F7. We would normally expect this to resolve to B flat, right? But instead the next section just goes back to F. That's a pretty neat red herring there. Okay, the fourth and last 8-bar section starts the same way as the second one, with F, F augmented and B flat major 7. In measure 4 though, it goes to G7. That's another secondary dominant chord, and that sets up a 1-6-2-5 progression in bars 5 and 6 of this section. Again, notice the difference between doing this with simple triads and tricking it out with inversions, seventh chords, extensions and suspensions. And then we get to the last two bars of the form, and here we have another fancy turnaround, like we did at the end of the first half. But while that first one was built on secondary dominants, this one uses modal interchange chords. It starts on F6-9, then E flat 6-9, A flat 6-9, D flat major 7, and C13 flat 9. The E flat, A flat and D flat chords are diatonic in the parallel key of F minor and are therefore modal interchange chords. And then they just take those two bars and move them up a half step. That's called a direct modulation, right? 1 second we're in the key of F and the next we're in F sharp. And then they repeat the entire form a half step higher. Okay, now let's look at the actual piano part. It was played by Earl Van Dyke, who was the house keyboardist at Motown at the time. If you want to check out my transcription of the whole song, link below. I'm gonna start with the second half of the song, the one that's in F sharp, because the piano part there is way simpler and therefore the better entry point, I think. So we start with a line cliché on F sharp, right? He plays the triad in root position with the root doubled at the octave. Then he just moves the fifth up in half steps. And then he lands on this voicing for the D sharp 7 flat 9 chord. Meanwhile, the left hand reinforces the chromatic line like this. As far as the comping rhythm is concerned, there isn't one consistent pattern, but there are two almost identical one-bar patterns in the right hand that make up the majority of the song. The first one is this, 2, 3, 4. And the second one is the same, except the last chord hits the 16th note earlier, 2, 3, 4. And then there are some occasional variations on these. And there's ghost notes in between the chords, and there's some melodic fills, and the left hand is all over the place rhythmically, but if you take these two patterns as your guide, you'll catch the vibe. Okay, the next two bars alternate between G sharp minor 7 and D sharp augmented 7. Here are the voicings. You take a G sharp minor 7, drop the root down into the bass range. You're left with a B major triad formed by the 3rd, 5th and 7th. Double the F sharp at the octave, and there's your G sharp minor 7 voicing. Here's a D sharp 7 chord. Drop the root down, raise the 5th to an augmented 5th, and there's your D sharp augmented 7 voicing. Next, we have the line cliche on the 2 minor chord, right? Where you move the root down in half steps. G sharp minor, G sharp minor major 7, G sharp minor 7, and C sharp 7. Then he goes back to the tonic chord F sharp, a little move to the 5 chord C sharp 7, and back to F sharp. Notice that he often just plays the 5th in the left hand, even in the bars where there's no line cliche. But keep in mind that there's a bass player who's playing the root, so he doesn't have to worry about the root not being there. Next, we got F sharp to F sharp augmented, and he plays the same voicings as before. And then he goes to B major 7 and B6, both of which he plays in root position. Notice that he doesn't worry about voice leading here at all. Not exactly the proper music professor way of connecting chords. But then again, this isn't proper music professor music, is it? It's fine, everybody calm down. This progression from a major 7 to a major 6 chord happens a bunch of times in this song, and in almost all cases he voices it the same way. Okay, next we got 3 minor 7 and 6 minor 7. Here are the voicings. Next we have the walk up from 2 minor to 3 minor to 4, and here it's worth comparing that same bar in the first chorus in F and the second chorus in F sharp. Same concept, slightly different execution. Here it is in F and in F sharp. Same idea of breaking up the minor 7 chords like this to create 16th note rhythms. And then in bar 16 of the form, we got this fancy turnaround I talked about earlier. Here's what the orchestra, strings and brass, plays here. And here's what plays. He took one look at that and went, I'm out. I'll let the orchestra play this. Good luck to you guys. In the first chorus, in F, he tries a little harder, but he still doesn't catch everything. Where the orchestra plays these fancy extended chords with alterations and everything, he plays some measly triads. But this is hard, and he was probably sight reading, so I pardon him. Am I not merciful? Bars 17 and 18 are almost the same as bars 1 and 2. Then we got a 2-5 progression, G sharp minor 7 to C sharp 7. And then the line cliche on the G sharp minor chord is the same as it was earlier. Then we got the F sharp major 7 to F sharp 6 I mentioned just a minute ago. This is followed by that 2-5 that seems to set up a move to the 4 chord. But it stays on the tonic chord instead. Then he plays a C sharp minor triad over an F sharp bass note, which is basically F sharp 7, and that one is followed by the 4 chord B major 7. Then he goes to G sharp 9, and then to a 1-6-2-5 turnaround. And then we get that second fancy turnaround at the end of the form, the one with the modal interchange chords. And once again, Earl wimps out a little bit. The orchestra plays this. And Earl plays much simpler voicings. Alright, before we wrap this up, I'd like to point out a few more things in the piano part of the first chorus, the one that's in the key of F. Overall, it's a lot more complex. There are fewer repeating patterns, the voicings are less consistent, there's more melodic fills. And it makes sense, because just like you and I, Earl Van Dyke had played a lot more songs in F than in F sharp. Plus, F sharp is also technically the more difficult key, I think. So comparing the first two bars of each chorus, for instance, is a good example of the difference in approach. We've already seen what he played in the F sharp chorus. Here's the same passage in the F chorus. That's a bit more creative. One element here is this blues lick. Similar licks are all over the first chorus. Here, 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 here. Notice that the chord here is A minor, which he knows because he's playing this A power chord in the left hand. And yet he plays this obvious F blues lick over it. That tells me that he's thinking of the A minor as a tonic chord, as a variation of the F chord, as am I. Then we got some more blues lingo here. And here. You get the idea. Another thing I noticed is he likes this shape a lot. Check out these three bars. He plays it on the F, the F augmented, and the B flat. He plays that last chord over G minor 7 as well. A lot of the time he slides into the middle note with a grace note to once again give it some blues flavor. Alright, I think that's enough for today. Again, if you'd like to check out the whole transcription, the link is in the description. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Peace.